Hello, and welcome to Episode 9 of Sorastro's Zombicide Black Plague painting series. In this episode, we're going to paint Baldric from Zemon's Zombicide Black Plague. I'll be employing a range of techniques to bring Baldric to life, including some wet blending and the use of zenithal highlights, which I'll be allowing to show through the base colours for select areas. Let's take a look at the painting stages. I've chosen to prime Baldric in black, followed with some zenithal highlights as detailed in Episode 5. This can be done either with an airbrush or with black and white spray cans. Next we'll apply the base colours, which will include some optional wet blending for places like the beard and the inner robes, and I'll be using a deliberately thin base layer for the outer robes to allow the zenithal highlights to show through. We'll then apply some shades to the miniature to help define the textures and darken the shadows. Next I'll be applying some highlights, many of which may be considered optional, depending on how quickly you want to get Baldric to the table. Our finishing touches will include providing some optional weathering and blood effects. Let's begin with the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting the skin, and I'm using a roughly equal mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Fleshtone. For the hair and beard, I'm going to create some tonal variation and a rough sense of volume by wet blending some Ushabti Bone with some white. If you want to save time, you could just mix the two to create a pale cream colour and use this for the entire area. Here I'm using the Ushabti Bone to roughly mark out the more shadowed sections of the hair. As usual, I've added a couple of drops of Vallejo's glaze medium to extend the drying time. I'm now applying the white to the remaining areas and roughly blending the two together. I'll be painting the sword in the same way we painted Nellie's in the previous episode. This means I'll be providing a base coat of Leadbelcher mixed with a little black and some dark sea blue. And for the staff, I'm using Steel Legion Drab. For the outer robe, I'm going to use a 3-to-1 mix of dark sea blue and Rhinox Hide. I've also chosen to thin this with 1 part of glaze medium to allow me to more easily create a somewhat thin layer without unwanted tide marks or coffee stains. You can see here the level of translucency that I'm after. What we're applying here is essentially the shadow tone, which means I'm happy for it to pool in the recesses. And because of the thin consistency, we can still clearly see the zenithal highlights showing through. This means we can achieve at least a good tabletop standard without necessarily having to add any further highlights. Once dry, you may wish to apply a second layer selectively to force some additional depth to any areas that appear too pale. This approach works better with some colours than others, but here we've achieved an easy yet striking effect, even if the finished result has a somewhat weathered and stone-washed appearance. For the inner robe, I'll be using Zandri Dust as my main colour, and I'm going to wet blend a 3:1 mix of Rhinox Hide and Dark Sea Blue to achieve some initial depth in the shadows. This is entirely optional, however, as we'll be providing some shade here later on, and a simple base coat of Zandri Dust would be okay. I'm first applying my Rhinox Hide and Dark Sea Blue mix to the shadowed areas, and I'm focusing on one side of the figure at a time. Now I'm applying the Zandri Dust to the broad areas of highlight. And I'm now blending the tones with a clean, damp brush. I'm now moving on to the left side of the figure. As mentioned, a simple base colour of Zandri Dust would be okay, but blending the shadow tone allows me to create a stronger sense of depth and volume than would be possible with a simple shade. With the main areas of the figure complete, we can now paint the smaller accessories, and I'm starting by painting the strap and belt with some Rhinox Hide. And I'm using some Steel Legion Drab for the pouch as well as the horn hanging from the belt. For the potion bottle, I'm using Naggaroth Night. And I'm painting the skulls with some Ushabti Bone. I'm also using this to articulate the decorative accents on the horn, as well as one or two other minor details. We can now pick out the metallic buckles with the metallic tone we used for the sword. And I'm using some Stormvermin Fur for the shoes. With the base colours complete, we're ready to add some shade. I'm going to begin by shading the staff with some neat Aggrax Earthshade. I'm then going to mix in a roughly equal amount of Nuln Oil and a similar quantity of Lahmian Medium. I'm then using this to shade all of the inner robe, accessories and shoes. We can also use this for the sword, as well as the hair and beard. Next I'm going to shade the skin with some Reikland Fleshshade. For the outer robe, I'm using an equal mix of Coelia Greenshade, Aggrax Earthshade and Lahmian Medium. This introduces a subtle green tint and creates a smoother overall look. We're now ready to add some highlights. Once the shades are dry, we can see that our Baldric is already looking pretty good, and most of these highlights could be considered optional. I wouldn't skip highlighting the skin, however, which I'm going to begin highlighting with some Cadian Fleshtone. I'm now jumping to some Kislev Flesh for the more prominent highlights. For the brightest highlights, I'm mixing in some white and a little Nurgling Green in a couple of stages. And here's my brightest highlight tone. To finish the skin off, I've decided to introduce some reddish tones to the nose and cheek area, using an equal mix of Reikland Fleshshade and Carroburg Crimson, thinned with the same amount of Lahmian medium. This can be applied in 2 or 3 layers to build up the desired effect. With the skin complete, I'm now moving on to the beard and hair, and I'm starting with an equal mix of Ushabti Bone and white. We can then lighten this by mixing in some additional white. and I'm using pure white for my brightest highlight. Here I'm using some Ushabti Bone to tone down some of the patches of shade. For the staff, I'm going to mix increasing quantities of Ivory into the original Steel Legion Drab base tone. I'm pushing the contrast quite far to suggest a polished wood finish. We can add additional shade to help maximise the contrast. I'm finishing the staff off with a few small touches of pure Ivory. I'm now going to highlight the inner robe, and I'll once again be using Ivory to brighten the tone. First, I'm using pure Zandri Dust. I'm now mixing in the Ivory in a few stages. As usual, I'm keeping the paint reasonably thin and building up each tone in a couple of layers. Here's my brightest highlight tone. This completes the inner robe. The outer robe already has adequate contrast and could be left as it is. I'm going to go ahead and add some highlights anyway, partly just to present it as an option, but also because I'd like to introduce some more cream-coloured hues into the highlights. So I'm going to return to my original base colour of Rhinox Hide and Dark Sea Blue, and mix in a roughly equal amount of Karak Stone. I'm keeping the consistency fairly thin and tracing over the main areas of highlight. I'm now mixing in additional quantities of Karak Stone to push the tone more towards a light beige. We can use the original dark shadow tone to clean up some of the recesses. For the brightest highlights, I'm going to mix in a little Ivory. I'm reserving these brightest highlights mostly for the upper ridges of fabric on the upturned sections of the arms and shoulders. With the robes complete, I'm now moving on to the smaller details, starting with the brown leather, which I'm highlighting with the original Rhinox Hide, to which I'm adding some XV88 in a couple of stages. Next I'm going to highlight the pouch with some Zandri Dust. I'm also using this for the darker sections of the horn. For the decorative skulls, I'm using Screaming Skull. I'm now going to lighten some Naggaroth Night with some Karak Stone and use this to highlight the potion bottle. I'm now adding additional Karak Stone for the upper highlights. Here I'm suggesting the reflection of the adjacent horn. I'm going to finish the bottle off with a small glint of pure ivory. We can now move on to the sword, and I'm going to start by cleaning the blade with the original base tone. I'm now creating my light metallic tone using Stormhost Silver mixed with a little Karak Stone and some dark sea blue, just as we did for Nelly in the previous episode. I'm using this for the flats of the blade, and we can draw the paint upwards towards the tip to create the beginnings of a simple gradient. I'm now increasing the proportion of Stormhost Silver in the mix. And I'm now using pure Stormhost Silver to brighten the tip and edges of the blade. Next, I'm going to mix equal amounts of black and dark sea blue, which I'm thinning with a few drops of water to create a dark glaze. We can then use this to darken the central fuller, and we can also glaze down towards the bottom of the blade to create more of a gradient. This can be done in a few layers to achieve whatever level of contrast you find most pleasing. With the other highlights in place, I've chosen to return to the decorative skulls and give them a small boost with a final hit of pure ivory. I'm now giving the shoes a simple highlight with the original Stormvermin Fur. And finally, I'm using the pale metallic sword tone to accent the metallic buckles. With the highlights complete, we're ready to add some finishing touches. I'm going to begin by painting the eyes with some ivory, followed with a small touch of German grey. I'm now tidying the right cheek with the skin highlight tone. Next I'm going to add some optional weathering to the robes using Typhus Corrosion. This can be applied both neat to create some concentrated splatter effects, and can be thinned down to create some more subtle staining. We can now go ahead and paint the base, and I'm using the same colours as detailed in episode 1. I'm then applying a matte spray for protection, before brushing some gloss varnish onto the potion bottle. You could also apply this to the staff for a more polished look if you like. And finally, I'm using my standard mix of Tamiya Clear Red, Rhinox Hide and Black to provide some blood. And this completes Baldric. Thank you for watching. With Baldric complete, we're just one hero away from completing the base set. After that, I look forward to working on select miniatures from the Wolfsburg and other expansions for Black Plague. To keep up with what I'm working on each month, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter or Sorastro.com, the links to which you can find in the video description. As always, my sincerest thanks go to the wonderful patrons who are funding this series and enabling me to create this content. With their help, I will soon be launching the first of a series of albums featuring the music written for the various paintings series. If you'd like to help support my work, you can do so by hitting the Patreon link and pledging anything from as little as $1. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Zombicide Black Plague. Happy painting!